I'm Lieutenant Commander Chloe Sterling, 32 years old. I built my career in the Navy, earned my medals in combat, and gave years of loyalty to a father who never saw my service as enough. For years, I stood by him, smoothing over his temper and carrying the Sterling name with pride. But at my own wedding, when my billionaire father slapped me across the face in front of 150 guests and tried to strip me of my medals, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The signs were always there, small cracks in the facade that I told myself were just my father's way of showing he cared. Harold Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, worth $3 billion according to Forbes, had opinions about everything I did, especially my uniform. Still playing soldier, I see. That's what he said when I walked into his corner office last spring, fresh from a commendation ceremony. I was wearing my dress blues, 3 new ribbons pinned to my chest alongside the others I'd earned over 8 years of service. Lieutenant Commander Chloe Sterling, that was my rank. I'd worked for it. He barely looked up from his computer screen. When are you going to put this hobby aside and join the company? The board keeps asking about succession planning. I sat down across from his mahogany desk, the same one where he'd taught me to read balance sheets when I was 12. Back then, I thought he was the smartest man alive. Now I wondered when I'd started feeling like I needed his permission to breathe. It's not a hobby, Dad. It's my career. Your career. He finally looked at me, his eyes scanning the ribbons dismissively. Chloe, you're 32 years old. You have responsibilities to this family, to the company your grandfather built. These little badges don't pay dividends. Little badges. That's what he called the Navy Cross I'd earned in Syria. The Purple Heart from the same deployment. The dozen other commendations that marked 8 years of service, 3 combat tours, and more sleepless nights than I cared to count. And this SEAL boyfriend of yours, he continued, pulling up something on his phone. Louis Ernest, is it? I had him looked into. Nice enough background, I suppose, but hardly suitable for someone in your position. My position. As if being his daughter was the most important thing I'd ever accomplish. His name is Lieutenant Commander Ernest, and we're engaged. Are you? He set down his phone and leaned back in his chair. I don't recall giving permission for that. That's when I realized he actually meant it. At 32, with my own career, my own life, he thought I needed his permission to get married. The conversation went downhill from there. It became a pattern over the next few months. Corporate dinners where he'd introduce me as my daughter, the one who's still figuring out what she wants to do with her life. Charity galas where he'd make jokes about my phase in front of potential clients. Board meetings where he'd casually mention that military service was fine for some people, but real leadership happened in the private sector. The worst part wasn't what he said. It was how others responded. Polite laughter. Knowing nods. As if my 8 years in the Navy were some kind of extended college experiment that I'd eventually outgrow. Louis saw it happening before I did. We'd been together for 2 years, and he knew how to read situations. It's what made him good at his job. He's trying to control you, he said one evening after a particularly brutal family dinner. We were walking along the harbor, the lights of the city reflecting off the water. Every conversation is about what he wants you to do, not what you want to do. He's always been protective. There's a difference between protective and controlling, Chloe. Protective would be asking if you're happy. This is something else. I wanted to argue with him, but the evidence was mounting. The way my father would schedule business calls during my leave time. The passive-aggressive comments about military housing when Louis and I started looking for a place together. The suggestion that maybe I should consider flexible duty so I could be more available for family obligations. 3 weeks before the wedding, it escalated. I'd worn my uniform to a Sterling Industries board meeting, not to make a statement, just because I was coming straight from base. The meeting was routine, quarterly numbers, and strategic planning. I sat in the back, mostly listening. Afterward, he called me into his office. That was inappropriate. What was inappropriate? The uniform. This is a business environment, Chloe. There's a time and place for everything. I looked down at my dress blues, the same uniform I'd worn to White House ceremonies, Pentagon briefings, and NATO conferences. I'm proud of what I do, Dad. Pride is fine. But you need to understand how things look. The board is already questioning my judgment about succession. Having you show up in costume doesn't help. Costume. That's what broke something in me. Not all at once, but like a hairline fracture that would eventually shatter the whole structure. These aren't costumes, I said quietly. They're earned. Earned? He laughed, actually laughed. Chloe, you've been playing war games for 8 years. It's time to grow up and take responsibility for your real life. I left his office that day knowing something had changed between us. I just didn't know how much. The wedding planning became a battlefield. He wanted the ceremony at the country club, with 500 guests and a reception that would double as a networking event. Louis and I wanted something smaller, more personal. We compromised on 150 people, but even that felt like too many strangers watching us make promises to each other. 2 days before the ceremony, my father pulled me aside after the rehearsal dinner. I need you to understand something, he said. Tomorrow is important. There will be investors there, board members, people who matter to the future of this company. I need you to be the daughter they expect to see. I'll be myself. No, Chloe. You'll be the future of Sterling Industries. Act accordingly. That night, Louis and I talked until dawn. He wanted to elope. Just drive to the courthouse and be done with it. Part of me wanted that too. But another part, the part that still remembered being 12 years old and believing my father was a hero, couldn't let go. I need to see this through, I told him. I need to know if he can respect who I am, just once. Louis took my hand in the darkness. And if he can't? I didn't have an answer then. I thought I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. I thought wrong. The morning of the wedding, I put on my uniform one more time. Not the wedding dress hanging in the closet, but my dress blues with every ribbon, every medal, every badge I'd earned. I looked in the mirror and saw 8 years of service, sacrifice, and honor looking back at me. I had no idea it would be the last time I'd look at that reflection without remembering the sound of his hand across my face. The reception hall buzzed with conversation, a mix of military precision and corporate polish. Louis's SEAL teammates stood at attention in their dress uniforms, while Sterling Industries executives adjusted their ties and checked their phones. 2 worlds that had never quite fit together, and me caught in the middle, trying to bridge a gap that maybe was never meant to be bridged. I should have known something was wrong when my father approached me during the cocktail hour. His face had that look, the one he wore during hostile takeovers and difficult board meetings. Cold calculation masked as concern. Chloe. He placed his hand on my arm, fingers gripping just a little too tight. We need to talk. Now? Dad, it's my wedding reception. Exactly. His voice carried that edge I'd learned to recognize, the tone that meant he'd made a decision and expected compliance. Look around this room. Do you see Senator Anderson? That's the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee. Next to him is General Hayes, and over there, the CEO of Lockheed Martin. These are important people, Chloe. People who matter. I followed his gaze across the room. Yes, I saw them. I also saw Louis's parents, simple people from Ohio who'd saved for months to afford the trip. I saw my Navy colleagues, men and women who'd served with honor in places most people couldn't find on a map. I saw friends who'd stood by me through deployments and promotions and late-night calls when the nightmares wouldn't stop. They're all important to me, Dad. His grip tightened. Don't be naive. Image matters in this business. Perception is everything. And right now, you're sending the wrong message. What message is that? He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not his intensity. That you're confused about your priorities. That you don't understand your position in this family, in this company, in this community. Before I could respond, he was moving, walking toward the center of the reception hall where the microphone waited for toasts and speeches. I followed, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. Usually, he made his disapproval known in private, with cutting remarks and disappointed sighs. This felt different. Public. The room quieted as he tapped the microphone. 150 faces turned toward him, expectant smiles ready for a father's tribute to his daughter on her wedding day. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. His voice carried the authority of boardrooms and shareholder meetings. I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this important day with the Sterling family. I stood beside Louis, his hand finding mine instinctively. Something in my father's tone made him tense, the way he did before a mission when the intelligence didn't quite add up. My daughter Chloe has always been headstrong, my father continued, his eyes finding mine across the room. Perhaps too headstrong for her own good. She's chosen a path that, frankly, I've never understood. Playing at being something she's not, when she has real responsibilities waiting for her. The sick feeling in my stomach turned to ice. He wasn't going to give a speech about love and happiness and new beginnings. This was something else entirely. Chloe. His voice cut across the room like a blade. Come here. Every instinct I'd developed in 8 years of military service told me not to move. But the daughter in me, the part that still remembered wanting his approval, still hoping he might surprise me with grace, took a step forward. Take off those ridiculous medals. The room went silent. Not the comfortable quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline, but the dead silence that comes when everyone realizes they're witnessing something they shouldn't see. Dad, take them off. His voice rose, carrying across the room to every corner, reaching every ear. You've shamed this family long enough with this charade. These people don't need to see you playing dress-up at your own wedding. I felt Louis move beside me, felt his hand on my shoulder. Felt the weight of 150 pairs of eyes watching this moment unfold. Saw my mother's face, pale and stricken, near the head table. Saw Senator Anderson lean toward his wife, whispering something behind his hand. No. My voice was steady, quieter than his, but carrying just as far. I earned them. That's when he moved. 3 steps across the space between us, his face dark with rage and embarrassment and something deeper. Something that looked like hatred for the woman I'd become instead of the daughter he'd planned. The slap echoed across the room like a gunshot. I felt the sting across my cheek, felt my head snap to the side from the force of it. But more than the physical pain was the shock of it, the public humiliation of being struck like a disobedient child in front of everyone who mattered to both of us. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would I crumble? Would I apologize? Would I finally become the obedient daughter he'd always demanded? But before I could react, before I could even process what had just happened, Louis was there. His hand caught my father's wrist midair as the older man drew back for another blow. Caught it and held it with the kind of strength that comes from years of training, the kind of grip that doesn't let go until the threat is neutralized. And then Louis spoke 6 words that changed everything. They should hear about your mistress. My father's face went white. Not pale, not surprised, but completely, utterly white, as if every drop of blood had drained from his head in an instant. The room erupted. Not in sound, but in a kind of collective intake of breath, a shared realization that they'd just witnessed something that would be talked about for years. Senator Anderson straightened in his chair. General Hayes set down his drink. The CEO of Lockheed Martin pulled out his phone. Louis released my father's wrist and stepped back, his arm moving around my shoulders. Protective but not possessive. Present but not controlling. My father stood frozen, his hand still raised, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. For the first time in my life, Harold Sterling had nothing to say. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt the satisfaction of seeing him finally exposed, finally held accountable for his hypocrisy. Instead, I felt hollow. Empty. Like something inside me had just died, something I hadn't even known I was still carrying until it was gone. The daughter who'd wanted his approval. She was gone now, killed by his hand across my face in front of everyone who mattered to both of us. I touched my cheek where his palm had landed, felt the heat still radiating from my skin. Then I looked around the room one more time, at all these important people who'd just seen the real Harold Sterling, and I walked away. Louis walked with me, his presence steady and sure beside me. We didn't run. We didn't hurry. We walked with the dignity of people who had nothing to be ashamed of, leaving behind a room full of whispers and a man who'd just destroyed his own reputation with a single moment of uncontrolled rage. Outside, in the cool evening air, I finally let myself breathe. Growing up in Harold Sterling's house was like living in a museum where I was both the prize exhibit and the least important artifact. Everything revolved around the company, around the image, around maintaining the reputation of a man who'd built an empire on precision and control. I was part of that image, expected to be perfect, polished, and perpetually grateful for the privilege of carrying the Sterling name. My earliest memories are of board meetings and charity galas, of being dressed up and paraded around as proof of my father's success in all areas of life. "Look at Harold Sterling," they'd say. "He's not just a brilliant businessman. He's a devoted family man too. See how well-behaved his daughter is, how articulate, how poised." I believed it then. Believed that being his daughter was the most important thing I could be, that his approval was worth any sacrifice. When he taught me to read financial statements at 12, I thought it was because he saw potential in me. When he brought me to important dinners, I thought it was because he valued my presence. When he talked about legacy and responsibility, I thought he was preparing me for greatness. It took me years to understand that I wasn't being prepared for anything. I was being shaped, molded into a version of myself that would complement his success rather than achieve my own. The military changed that, or started to. I joined the Navy not to rebel against him, but because I wanted to serve something larger than myself. I wanted to earn respect rather than inherit it, to prove my worth through actions rather than ancestry. The first time I put on the uniform, I felt like I was becoming who I was always meant to be. My father saw it differently. He saw my service as a phase, a temporary deviation from the path he'd laid out for me. When I made lieutenant, he congratulated me with the same tone he'd use for a good grade on a college exam. When I earned my first commendation, he framed it and hung it in his office next to photos of himself with presidents and prime ministers, as if my achievement was really his. But I was changing, becoming someone he hadn't planned for. Every deployment made me more independent. Every promotion gave me confidence that didn't depend on his approval. Every mission taught me that leadership wasn't about control, it was about service. The first time I openly disagreed with him, I was 28. He wanted me to leave the Navy and join Sterling Industries as a vice president, starting at a salary that would have taken me 15 years to earn in the military. It was a generous offer, objectively speaking. It was also a cage. "I'm not ready," I told him over dinner at his favorite restaurant. "I want to finish my commitment. Your commitment is to this family. My commitment is to both." He didn't argue that night, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was already planning his next move, figuring out how to bring me back into line. That's what he did with problems. He analyzed them, strategized solutions, and executed plans until he got the outcome he wanted. For the next 4 years, he tried everything. Financial pressure, emotional manipulation, family obligations that coincidentally conflicted with my military duties. He was subtle about it, never quite crossing the line into outright sabotage, but always making it clear that my choices were disappointing him and, by extension, disappointing the family. When I met Louis, the pressure intensified. Not because my father disliked him personally, but because Louis represented a choice I was making without consultation, a future I was building outside his influence. Louis was everything my father wasn't, steady where my father was volatile, secure where my father was desperate for control, honest where my father was calculating. "He's not ambitious," my father said after meeting Louis for the first time. "He's settling for a government salary and a pension. Is that really the kind of man you want to build a life with?" But Louis's lack of ambition for money and power was exactly what drew me to him. He wanted to serve his country, protect his teammates, and build a quiet life with someone he loved. Simple goals that had nothing to do with stock prices or board meetings or maintaining an image for public consumption. Our relationship deepened as my relationship with my father deteriorated. Not because I was choosing Louis over family, but because I was choosing authenticity over performance. I was tired of being Harold Sterling's daughter first and Chloe Sterling second. tired of having every conversation filtered through his expectations and ambitions. The engagement was supposed to be a compromise. A wedding that honored both families, both backgrounds, both sets of values. I should have known my father would see it as an opportunity rather than a celebration. Should have known he'd view our guest list as a networking opportunity and our ceremony as a reflection of his reputation rather than our commitment. But some part of me, the daughter who'd once believed he was the smartest man alive, still hoped he might surprise me. Still hoped that when it mattered most, when I was at my happiest, he might choose love over control, support over manipulation, pride in who I'd become over disappointment in who I'd refused to be. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things when it came to Harold Sterling. But I wasn't wrong about Louis, and I wasn't wrong about the choice I'd made to build a life based on respect rather than fear, partnership rather than ownership, love rather than possession. The slap taught me something I'd been too naive to understand. My father didn't love me despite my choices. He loved the idea of me making the choices he would have made. When I refused to be that person, when I insisted on being myself, his love revealed itself as conditional, transactional, dependent on my compliance with his vision for my life. It was a painful lesson, but a necessary one. Some bridges have to burn before you can build new ones. Some relationships have to end before better ones can begin. Some daughters have to walk away from their fathers before they can become the women they were meant to be. The morning after the wedding, my phone buzzed with 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. All from my father. All variations on the same theme. Fix this, control the damage, protect the family reputation. As if the slap had been my fault, as if Louis's revelation had been my choice, as if I was somehow responsible for cleaning up the mess he'd made. I turned off my phone and went for a run instead. Louis had already left for base, giving me space to process what had happened without having to perform strength I didn't feel yet. The apartment felt different that morning, lighter somehow, like a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Even the air seemed cleaner. By noon, the calls started coming to our landline. First my mother, then my father's assistant, then family friends who'd been at the wedding and wanted to check on me, but really wanted to gossip about what they'd witnessed. I unplugged the phone and made coffee instead. The first 24 hours were the hardest. Not because I regretted what had happened, but because I was grieving something I'd never really had, the father I'd imagined him to be. The man who would have been proud of my service, supportive of my choices, grateful for the daughter I'd become rather than resentful of the daughter I'd refused to be. But grief, I'd learned in the military, was a luxury you couldn't afford during active operations. And this was an active situation, requiring tactical thinking rather than emotional processing. By the third day, the consequences were becoming clear. Sterling Industries stock had dropped 2% on rumors of internal family conflicts. 3 board members had requested private meetings with my father. Senator Anderson had postponed a defense contract meeting that had been scheduled for months. The mistress story was spreading through Washington's social circles like wildfire, carried by the same people who'd witnessed his public assault on his own daughter. My father tried a different approach then. Flowers arrived at our apartment with a card that read, "Let's talk privately." Then gifts, jewelry, electronics, things he thought might soften my position. When those failed, he sent his lawyer with documents transferring a trust fund into my name, millions of dollars that would be mine immediately if I signed a non-disclosure agreement about recent family disagreements. I burned the documents in our fireplace and sent the ashes back in the same envelope. That's when he got desperate. "Chloe, please." His voice on the voicemail sounded older, friendlier than I'd ever heard it. "You're my daughter. You're all I have. We can work this out, we can fix this. Just call me back." But he was wrong about that. I wasn't all he had, and he wasn't all I had. He had his company, his reputation, his billions of dollars, and his board of directors, and his network of powerful friends who were already distancing themselves from the liability he'd become. And I had Louis, I had my career, I had 8 years of service that had taught me the difference between loyalty and submission, between family and ownership. The breaking point came 2 weeks after the wedding. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking haggard and desperate in a way I'd never seen before. His hair was uncombed, his suit wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "You have to help me," he said when I opened the door. "The board is calling for my resignation. The contracts are being canceled. Everything I've built is falling apart because of what happened at your wedding. Because of what you did at my wedding. Because of what he said." His voice turned sharp again, familiar in its blame-shifting. "That seal boyfriend of yours destroyed me with 6 words. 6 words, Chloe. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you've cost me?" I looked at him standing in my doorway, this man who'd raised me and shaped me and ultimately rejected me, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no guilt. Just a kind of empty recognition that we were strangers now, had maybe always been strangers. "I didn't cost you anything," I said. "You did this to yourself the moment you decided to hit me in front of a room full of people. Everything that's happened since then is just consequences catching up." He tried to push past me, tried to come inside so we could discuss this properly, but I blocked his way. 8 years in the Navy had taught me how to hold a position when it mattered. "I'm not covering for you anymore," I said. "I'm not making excuses. I'm not managing your image. I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not so you can feel better about the choices you've made. Find someone else to fix your problems." I closed the door in his face and locked it. He stood outside for 20 minutes, knocking and calling my name and making promises he had no intention of keeping. Then he left, and I haven't seen him since. The silence that followed was profound. No more calls, no more gifts, no more attempts at reconciliation. He'd finally understood that I meant what I said, that his daughter was done being his safety net, his image consultant, his excuse for why a man who could run a billion-dollar company couldn't manage his own personal life. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like freedom. 6 months later, the changes were undeniable. My father's empire wasn't crumbling exactly, but it was contracting. Key contracts had been lost, important partnerships dissolved, board members replaced with people who had less tolerance for scandal and more interest in actual leadership than image management. Meanwhile, I was thriving. The Navy had promoted me to commander, a recognition of work I'd been doing for years, but that had somehow been overshadowed by my father's constant demands for attention and energy. My colleagues, the ones who'd witnessed his behavior at the wedding, treated me with a respect that felt different now, deeper. Not because they pitied me, but because they'd seen me handle a crisis with dignity and strength. Louis and I had settled into a rhythm that felt natural in a way my relationship with my father never had. We made decisions together, supported each other's careers, built a life based on mutual respect rather than one person's need to control the other. It was quiet and steady, and exactly what I'd been missing for 32 years without knowing it. The contrast was stark. Where my father demanded loyalty through guilt and manipulation, Louis earned it through consistency and trust. Where my father saw my military service as competition for my attention, Louis saw it as part of what made me who I was. Where my father required constant management of his emotions and ego, Louis simply showed up as himself and let me do the same. The difference extended beyond our relationship to every area of my life. Without the constant pressure to manage my father's expectations, I had energy for things that actually mattered to me. I volunteered with a program that helped military families navigate deployment cycles. I took advanced training courses that would prepare me for higher command positions. I slept better, laughed more, felt like myself in ways I hadn't since childhood. Not everything was perfect. There were moments when I missed the idea of having a father, when I saw other people with their parents and felt the absence like a physical ache. Holidays were complicated, family events awkward, questions from well-meaning friends about why I never mentioned my family any more difficult to navigate. But those moments were overshadowed by a peace I'd never experienced before. The peace that comes from living authentically, from making choices based on your own values rather than someone else's expectations, from understanding that love is supposed to expand you rather than diminish you. My father made one last attempt at contact, a letter delivered by courier on what would have been my 33rd birthday. It was 3 pages long, filled with apologies that felt calculated rather than genuine, explanations that blamed everyone but himself for what had happened, and promises of change that I'd heard too many times to believe. The final paragraph was the most telling. "I know you think I don't love you, but you're wrong. I've always loved you. I just wanted you to be everything you could be, to live up to your potential, to not waste the opportunities that come with being a Sterling. Maybe I pushed too hard, but it was only because I believed in you. I read it twice, then filed it away without responding. Because he was wrong about that too. He'd never loved me for who I was, only for who he thought I should become. He'd never wanted me to live up to my potential, only to his version of what my potential should be. And he'd never believed in me, only in his ability to shape me into something that would reflect well on him. Real love looked different. It looked like Louis celebrating my promotion without trying to redirect the conversation to his own achievements. It looked like my Navy colleagues respecting my decisions even when they disagreed with them. It looked like building a life based on values I'd chosen rather than inherited, goals I'd set rather than been assigned, relationships that enriched me rather than depleted me. It looked like standing in my dress uniform, medals intact, at a ceremony honoring military families, knowing that every ribbon on my chest represented something I'd earned through service rather than been given through accident of birth. It looked like coming home to a partner who saw my strength as attractive rather than threatening, who supported my ambitions rather than competing with them. It looked like finally understanding that some relationships are worth fighting for, and others are worth walking away from, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference. The wedding that was supposed to be a celebration became a turning point instead. Not the humiliation my father intended, but a moment of clarity that changed everything. A public revelation of who we really were when the masks came off, when the pressure mounted, when the choice had to be made between control and love. He chose control. I chose love. And that, more than anything else, made all the difference. 2 years have passed since that wedding day, and the story has become legend in certain circles. Not the version my father would tell, where an ungrateful daughter destroyed a family legacy over a simple misunderstanding, but the true version, where a woman finally claimed her own life after decades of living someone else's expectations. I'm Captain Chloe Ernest now, promoted twice in 24 months and commanding a unit that deploys to some of the most challenging locations in the world. The work is demanding, dangerous sometimes, but it's mine in a way that nothing in my father's world ever was. Every decision I make, every challenge I face, every success I achieve belongs to me rather than reflecting on someone else's reputation. Louis made Captain too, leading a SEAL team that operates with the kind of precision and trust that comes from understanding what each person brings to the mission. We're both away more than civilian couples, but when we're together, we're completely present. No divided loyalties, no competing priorities, no need to perform for anyone other than each other. The Sterling Industries saga played out exactly as you might expect. My father managed to hold on to control of the company, but barely. 3 major contracts were canceled, 2 board members resigned, and the stock price took 18 months to recover to pre-wedding levels. The mistress story had legs, as Washington scandals tend to do, spawning articles about powerful men who believed their success exempted them from consequences. He survived it, professionally speaking. Diminished but not destroyed, chastened but not changed. From what I hear through mutual acquaintances, he tells people that I was corrupted by military culture, that my marriage to a man with limited ambitions explains my poor judgment, that he's disappointed but still hopeful I'll come to my senses eventually. The delusion would be sad if it weren't so revealing. Even now, even after everything, he can't accept that I made choices based on my own values rather than his. Can't acknowledge that leaving his orbit was a promotion rather than a failure, that building a life based on service and partnership was success rather than settling. My mother and I speak occasionally, careful conversations that dance around the subjects that matter most. She stayed with him, which doesn't surprise me. 40 years of marriage to Harold Sterling teaches you to accommodate rather than challenge, to manage rather than confront. She's asked me to consider reconciliation several times, using phrases like family healing and moving forward, but she's never asked him to apologize, never suggested that he might need to change rather than just waiting for me to forgive. I don't blame her for that choice, but I don't share it either. Some bridges, once burned, aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some relationships, once revealed as fundamentally unbalanced, can't be fixed with better communication or mutual understanding. Some people love conditionally, and others love completely, and no amount of history or shared DNA can bridge that gap. The medals are still there, pinned to my dress uniform in precise rows that tell the story of 8 years in service to something larger than myself. The Navy Cross, the Purple Heart, the commendations and ribbons that mark deployments and achievements and moments when courage was required rather than just preferred. They catch the light sometimes, small pieces of metal that represent values I've chosen to live by rather than inherited by accident of birth. When I look at them now, I don't think about the night my father called them ridiculous accessories, or the moment he demanded I remove them in front of everyone who mattered to both of us. Instead, I think about the missions they represent, the people they honor, the commitment they symbolize to something beyond personal ambition or family legacy. Real legacy isn't measured in billions of dollars or boardroom power or the ability to control other people's choices. It's measured in service given freely, love offered without conditions, values lived consistently regardless of the cost. It's measured in the kind of person you choose to be when no one is watching, the kind of partner you are when the relationship is tested, the kind of leader you become when people trust you with their lives. My wedding day began as a celebration of love and ended as a demonstration of character. Not the character my father revealed when he let his need for control override his love for his daughter, but the character Louis showed when he protected me without asking what it might cost him. And the character I found when I finally chose authenticity over approval. The room full of witnesses that day saw more than they bargained for. They saw what happens when a man who's built his life on image and power meets a situation he can't manipulate or control. They saw what happens when someone who's been trained to handle pressure under fire applies that training to personal relationships. They saw what love looks like when it's tested by betrayal, and what strength looks like when it's measured by the ability to walk away from toxicity rather than the ability to endure it. The story doesn't end with revenge or reconciliation, or any of the dramatic resolutions that make for satisfying fiction. It ends with the quiet satisfaction of a life built on chosen values rather than inherited expectations, relationships based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics, success measured by service rather than accumulation. It ends with understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint someone whose approval was never worth earning, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from a battle you were never meant to fight, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst instincts by making excuses for their behavior. My father taught me many things over the years, most of them unintentionally. He taught me that money without character is just accounting, that power without restraint is just bullying, that love without respect is just possession. He taught me to recognize the difference between people who support your dreams and people who try to reshape them, between relationships that expand you and relationships that diminish you. Most importantly, he taught me that family is a choice you make every day, not an obligation you inherit at birth. The people who earn that designation are the ones who see your worth without needing to own your choices, who celebrate your successes without needing to claim credit for them, who love you not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Louis understands this in ways my father never could. When I come home from deployments, he doesn't ask if I'm ready to consider other career options. When I receive commendations, he doesn't suggest they'd look better in his office than mine. When I make decisions about my life, my career, my future, he trusts that I know what's best for me and offers support rather than alternative plans. This is what I should have had all along. This is what love looks like when it's not filtered through control, not conditional on compliance, not dependent on someone else's version of who you should be. It's steady and sure and strong enough to survive conflict, honest enough to address problems, secure enough to celebrate differences rather than eliminate them. The woman who stood in that reception hall 2 years ago, who refused to remove her medals and absorbed a slap meant to break her spirit, she's still here. Stronger now, clearer about her values, more confident in her choices. The ribbons on her uniform tell a story of service and sacrifice and commitment to principles that matter more than profit margins or stock prices or social standing. She wears them with pride, not because they prove anything to anyone else, but because they represent something true about who she chose to become when faced with the option of taking an easier path. They represent integrity under pressure, courage in the face of opposition, loyalty to values that transcend personal benefit. Real legacy isn't what you accumulate or control or force others to acknowledge. It's what you contribute, what you protect, what you stand for when standing costs you something you thought you couldn't afford to lose. It's measured not in dollars or power or deference, but in the lives you touch, the service you provide, the example you set for others who face similar choices between comfort and character. My father will never understand this. He'll continue to measure success by the size of his company, the balance in his accounts, the influence he wields over others. He'll continue to see my choices as rebellion rather than growth, my marriage as settling rather than ascending, my military service as a phase rather than a calling. That's his loss, not mine. His failure to recognize value that can't be quantified, love that can't be commanded, strength that doesn't require others to be weak. His inability to see that the daughter he tried to control became exactly who she was meant to be when she finally escaped his expectations. I don't hate him for it anymore. Hatred requires energy I'd rather spend on people and purposes that deserve it. Instead, I feel something closer to pity for a man so focused on managing appearances that he missed the reality of having a daughter who achieved everything he claimed to want for her, just not in the form he'd imagined. The medals stay. The uniform stays. The marriage stays. The career stays. The choice to build a life based on service rather than accumulation, respect rather than deference, love rather than control, that stays too. And if someone asks about that night, about the wedding where a billionaire CEO slapped his daughter and lost everything that mattered in 6 words from a Navy SEAL, I tell them the truth. Not the version that makes for better gossip, but the version that makes for better understanding. Sometimes you have to lose the family you were born into to find the family you were meant to have. Sometimes you have to walk away from approval to find acceptance. Sometimes you have to disappoint the wrong people to become the right person. The story ends here, with a woman in uniform who knows her worth, a marriage built on mutual respect, a career dedicated to service, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to chosen values rather than inherited expectations. It ends with understanding that real strength isn't the ability to control others, but the courage to be yourself regardless of who approves. The medals catch the light as I write this. Small pieces of metal that represent large pieces of truth about what matters and what doesn't, what lasts and what fades, what's worth fighting for and what's worth walking away from. They're mine, earned through service and sacrifice and the decision to stand for something larger than personal ambition. They're staying exactly where they are. 3 years after the wedding, I received an unexpected call from my father's assistant. Margaret had worked for Sterling Industries for 23 years, managing his calendar and his crises with equal efficiency. Her voice was different this time, softer, more personal than the professional tone she'd always used during my childhood visits to his office. "Captain Ernest? I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I got your number from the Navy directory. What can I do for you, Margaret? It's about your father. He's had a heart attack. He's stable now, but the doctors say it was significant. He's asking for you." I sat in my office at the base, looking out at the training grounds where my unit was running formation drills. The request felt surreal after 3 years of complete silence. No birthday cards, no holiday calls, no acknowledgement of my promotions or Lewis's achievements. Nothing. And now, when he was vulnerable, when he needed something from me, suddenly I was his daughter again. "Is he going to recover?" "The doctors think so, yes. But it will be a long process. He's been asking for you since he woke up in the ICU. He wants to see you." I told her I'd think about it and ended the call. That evening, Lewis and I talked it through over dinner, the same careful discussion we'd have about any mission with complex variables and uncertain outcomes. "What do you want to do?" he asked, because that's how our relationship worked. No pressure, no assumptions, just honest questions that helped me think through the decision. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should go. He's still my father, regardless of everything else. But another part of me wonders if this is just another manipulation. Crisis brings out people's worst instincts sometimes. And sometimes it brings out their best. That was Louis, always willing to see potential for growth even in people who'd proven themselves incapable of it. It was one of the things I loved about him, even when it challenged my own more skeptical instincts. I went to see him 2 days later, wearing civilian clothes instead of my uniform. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear, familiar from too many visits to wounded teammates over the years. My father looked smaller in the hospital bed, older, diminished by machines and monitors that beeped steadily in the background. "Chloe." His voice was weak, but his eyes were alert. "You came. Margaret said you were asking for me." He nodded, struggling to sit up straighter. "I've been thinking. About the wedding. About what happened between us. About mistakes I've made." I pulled a chair next to his bed, but didn't sit down yet. "What kind of mistakes?" "All of them." He laughed, but it came out as more of a wheeze. "The slap. The things I said about your service. The way I treated your husband. The way I treated you your entire life, if I'm being honest." This was new territory. Harold Sterling admitting mistakes, accepting responsibility, acknowledging that his behavior had consequences. I wanted to believe it was genuine, but 32 years of experience made me cautious. "Dad, you almost died." People say things when they're scared that they don't necessarily mean when they're better. Maybe. But I've had a lot of time to think these past few days. Do you know what I kept coming back to? That night at the wedding, when you refused to take off your medals. You were right to refuse. They weren't ridiculous. I was. I sat down then, because this conversation required more balance than I could maintain while standing. "You were angry." People say things when they're angry. No, Chloe. I wasn't angry. I was scared. He turned his head to look at me directly. I was scared that I'd raised a daughter who was stronger than me, braver than me, better than me in every way that mattered. And instead of being proud of that, I tried to tear you down to make myself feel bigger. The monitors continued their steady beeping while I processed what he'd said. This was the conversation I'd wanted to have for years, the acknowledgement I'd waited for, the apology I'd stopped expecting. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt complicated. Why no? Why not 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, or when I first joined the Navy? Because I wasn't dying 3 years ago. He smiled, a shadow of the confident expression I remembered from childhood. Funny how mortality clarifies things. Makes you realize what actually matters and what's just ego dressed up as principle. We talked for 2 hours that day. Not the careful, performative conversations of my childhood, but real dialogue between two adults who'd hurt each other and were trying to figure out if there was a path forward. He asked about my career, my marriage, my life in ways that suggested genuine interest rather than strategic intelligence gathering. "Are you happy?" he asked as visiting hours were ending. "Yes. Very happy." "Good. That's what I should have wanted all along. Your happiness, not your compliance." I left the hospital that day feeling something I hadn't expected: hope. Not for a complete reconciliation, not for erasing years of damage with one honest conversation, but for the possibility that people could change, that relationships could evolve. That forgiveness didn't have to mean forgetting, but might mean moving forward differently. Louis was waiting when I got home, takeout containers from our favorite Thai place arranged on the kitchen table. He didn't ask how it went right away, just let me settle in, eat something, find my equilibrium before we talked through what had happened. He apologized, I told him finally. Actually apologized. Not the non-apology version where he explains why his behavior was justified, but a real acknowledgement that he was wrong. How do you feel about that? Confused. Relieved. Suspicious. Hopeful. All at the same time. Louis reached across the table and took my hand. "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to see if it's real. If he means it, if he's actually capable of change, or if this is just fear talking and he'll go back to being himself once he recovers. And if it's real, then maybe we can build something different. Not the relationship we had before, but something based on who we actually are instead of who he wanted me to be." The recovery was slow and complicated, like most meaningful changes. My father spent 6 weeks in various stages of hospital care, then months of cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle modifications that forced him to confront mortality in ways he'd never had to before. I visited twice a week, conversations that gradually became easier as we learned to relate to each other without the power dynamics that had defined our relationship for decades. He asked questions about my military service that went beyond surface details, genuine curiosity about the work I did, the people I served with, the missions that had shaped my understanding of leadership and sacrifice. He listened when I talked about Lewis's career, about the challenges and rewards of military marriage, about the life we'd built together. Most surprisingly, he began to share things about himself that had nothing to do with business success or family legacy. Stories about his own father, a man I'd barely known who died when I was young. Regrets about choices he'd made in building the company, relationships he'd sacrificed for success that suddenly seemed less important than he'd believed. "I thought providing for you meant giving you everything I'd never had," he said during one of these conversations. Financial security, social position, opportunities that money could buy. I never considered that what you might need most was something I'd forgotten how to give. Which was unconditional support. The freedom to become whoever you were meant to be, not whoever I thought you should be. The conversations weren't always easy. There were moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, when his instinct for control bumped up against my hard-won independence, when we had to consciously choose to interact differently than we always had. But the difference now was that we both recognized these moments and made efforts to correct course rather than escalating into familiar conflicts. Lewis joined us for some of these visits, and I watched my father make genuine efforts to understand and respect the man I'd married. He asked about SEAL training, about deployment challenges, about the kind of leadership required when people's lives depend on your decisions. The questions weren't strategic or calculating. They came from someone trying to understand a world completely different from his own. "Your husband is a good man," he told me after one of these conversations. I didn't see it before because I was looking for the wrong things. I was measuring him against standards that don't actually matter. What do you see now? Someone who loves you for who you are instead of who you could become for him. Someone who makes you stronger instead of smaller. Someone who earns respect instead of demanding it. These words meant more to me than any apology because they showed understanding, not just regret. They showed that he'd learned to recognize value in forms he'd previously dismissed, to appreciate qualities he'd never prioritized, to see strength in ways that didn't require others to be weak. The business suffered during his recovery, but not catastrophically. The crisis he'd predicted if he ever stepped back from daily operations never materialized. The company continued functioning, projects moved forward, decisions got made without his direct involvement. This taught him something he'd never been willing to accept, that his worth wasn't measured solely by his indispensability, that success didn't require his constant control, that other people were capable of handling responsibilities he'd never been willing to delegate. "I spent 40 years building something I thought would collapse without me," he said during one of our later conversations. "Turns out it was stronger than I gave it credit for. Maybe if I'd trusted other people more, I would have had more time for the things that actually mattered." 6 months after his heart attack, he was cleared to return to work part-time. Instead of resuming his previous schedule of 16-hour days and weekend board meetings, he chose to work 4 days a week, delegating more responsibility to senior executives he'd previously micromanaged. The change wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. He was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, to measure success differently. The real test came during my next deployment. Lewis and I were both assigned to a classified mission that would keep us overseas for 4 months. In the past, my father would have used my absence as evidence that military service was incompatible with family obligations, would have pressured me to consider alternatives that would keep me closer to home. This time was different. He called before we left, not to argue about my choices, but to tell me he was proud of my service and would be thinking of both Lewis and me while we were away. He sent care packages that included not just personal items, but things for my entire unit, understanding that military service was communal rather than individual. When we returned, he was there at the base to welcome us home, standing with other military families, wearing a simple suit instead of the power wardrobe that had once defined his public appearances. He hugged me without reserve, shook Lewis's hand with genuine respect, and asked about our mission in ways that showed he understood the difference between curiosity and classified information. "You both look good," he said as we walked to our car. "Tired, but good. Like people who know what they're doing with their lives." That evening, he joined us for dinner at our house, the first time he'd been in our home since before the wedding. He admired the photos on our walls, pictures from deployments and ceremonies and quiet moments that told the story of our life together. He asked Lewis about his latest training exercises, listened to stories about teammates and challenges and small victories that civilian success couldn't quite capture. "I understand now," he said as the evening was ending, "why you chose this life. It's not about the money or the recognition or the career advancement. It's about being part of something that matters, serving something larger than yourself." "It's what you taught me, actually," I said, surprising both of us. "You always talked about legacy, about building something that would last beyond your own life. I just found a different way to do it." He nodded, understanding something that had taken him years to recognize. Different, but not wrong. Maybe better, in ways I was too stubborn to see. The relationship we've built isn't perfect. There are still moments when his old instincts surface, when he makes suggestions that sound suspiciously like attempts to manage my choices. There are times when my guard goes up, when I respond to innocent questions as if they're strategic probes. We're both learning new patterns, and change at this level doesn't happen overnight. But it's real. The man who slapped me at my wedding reception, who demanded I remove my medals in front of 150 witnesses, who spent years trying to control my life because he couldn't accept my independence. That man has done the hardest thing possible for someone like him. He's admitted he was wrong, changed his behavior, and learned to love me for who I am rather than who he wanted me to be. The medals are still there, still catching the light when I wear my dress uniform to ceremonies and formal events. But they mean something different now. They're not symbols of rebellion or independence or the choice between family and authenticity. They're simply what they were always meant to be: recognition of service, sacrifice, and commitment to values that transcend personal interest. My father sees them that way now too. The last time I wore my uniform to a family event, he introduced me to his colleagues not as my daughter who's still figuring out her path, but as Captain Ernest, who's serving our country with distinction. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, the respect genuine. The story that began with a slap and 6 words that changed everything has become something unexpected, a testament to the possibility of growth, forgiveness, and the kind of love that's strong enough to survive its own mistakes. It's messier than the clean narrative of walking away from toxicity, more complicated than the simple satisfaction of cutting ties with people who can't accept you. But it's also more hopeful. It suggests that people can change, that relationships can evolve, that bridges burned by anger and pride can sometimes be rebuilt with patience and genuine commitment to doing better. Not all relationships deserve this effort, and not all people are capable of real change. But some are, and recognizing the difference is part of wisdom. The real measure of change came 18 months later at Lewis's promotion ceremony. He was being promoted to lieutenant colonel, a recognition of his leadership during our last deployment and his reputation among fellow officers. The ceremony was held at the base chapel, a simple affair with military colleagues and close friends in attendance. My father asked if he could come. Not demanded, not assumed he was invited, but asked with the kind of uncertainty that showed he understood his presence wasn't guaranteed or expected. I told him yes, but warned him that this was Lewis's day, not an opportunity for networking or business conversations. He arrived in a conservative suit, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone attending an important event that wasn't about him. He sat with Lewis's parents, listening to the chaplain speak about service and sacrifice, watching as Lewis received his new rank insignia with the same attention he'd once reserved for board meetings and corporate presentations. During the reception afterward, I watched him navigate conversations with military families, defense contractors, and career officers. The old Harold Sterling would have dominated these interactions, turning every introduction into a potential business opportunity, every conversation into a platform for establishing his own importance. This version listened more than he spoke, asked questions that showed genuine interest in others' experiences, and introduced himself simply as Chloe's father rather than the CEO of Sterling Industries. When one of Lewis's SEAL teammates mentioned the wedding incident, not maliciously, but as part of explaining how they'd met, my father didn't deflect or make excuses. He nodded and said quietly, "That was the worst day of my life, and not for the reasons you might think. I'm grateful my daughter is stronger than her father's mistakes." Later, as we were cleaning up, Lewis approached my father with something I'd never seen before: easy familiarity. They developed their own relationship over the months of recovery and rebuilding, separate from my involvement, based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. "Thank you for being here today," Lewis said. "It meant a lot to both of us." "Thank you for letting me be part of it," my father replied. "I know I haven't earned the right to celebrate your achievements, but I'm grateful for the chance to try." They shook hands, but it was more than formality. It was acknowledgement between two men who'd found their way to understanding despite a disastrous first impression and years of mutual wariness. That evening, as we walked to our cars in the parking lot, my father stopped and turned to face both of us. "I want you to know something," he said. "What I see when I look at you two together, the respect, the partnership, the way you make each other stronger, that's what I should have had with your mother. That's what I should have wanted for you from the beginning." It was an admission that went beyond our relationship to acknowledge deeper patterns, broader failures, a life built on the wrong foundations. He wasn't asking for sympathy or making excuses, just stating a truth that had taken him too long to recognize. "It's not too late to build something different," I said, meaning it. "With Mom, with the company, with the rest of your life." He smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from him since childhood. "Your mother and I are working on it. Slowly, but we're working on it. She's stronger than I gave her credit for too." As Lewis and I drove home that night, I realized that the story that began with a public humiliation and 6 words that changed everything had become something I never expected, a testament to the possibility of redemption. Not just for me, but for all of us. The wounded daughter, the controlling father, the marriage built on respect rather than power, the family learning to love without conditions, all of it imperfect, all of it ongoing, all of it real in ways that fairy tale endings never are. The metals catch the light still, small pieces of metal that represent large pieces of truth about service and sacrifice and the choice to stand for something beyond personal ambition. But they're no longer symbols of division or independence or the price of authenticity. They're simply what they were always meant to be: recognition of duty fulfilled, honor maintained, and the courage to become who you're meant to be regardless of who approves. Thanks for watching. I stood my ground, kept my medals, and chose respect over control. Now I want to hear from you. Has a parent or a relative ever tried to shame you in public? What did you do? Where's the line between family loyalty and protecting your peace? If you knew a powerful person's secret, would you expose it to stop their abuse? Why or why not? Who showed up for you when it mattered? Did anyone surprise you? Drop your story in the comments. I read them. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a push to set boundaries.